Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of diaXpora. Empower international students and immigrants to build their career in Australia and thrive in every aspect of life here. I'm your host, Taylor, and today our guest is Professor Aaron Quigley, Director at CSIRO's Data 61, University of Sydney's Chair of Industry Advisory Board, and also Professor of Computer Science at UNSW. In today's episode, we're going to talk about research and academia as a career, and the pros and cons of the industry in general, academia versus industry, and how to break into it for international students. Welcome, Aaron.
Nice to meet you.
First of all, I guess, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came into research and academia as a career? Have you always dreamt of becoming a researcher when you grew up?
That's a good question. So I did my undergraduate studies in computer science in Trinity College in Dublin in Ireland. And while I was there, I got to work in industry in Germany and the USA and also in Ireland. It was during my time in the USA that I got exposure to some of the research that was underway in industry and how the applied research was working. And it was during that time that I got to partake in some of the research that was the company I was working in had started performing. And then that sparked my interest in going back to do more research in my honours degree back in Ireland. But then I came to Australia as an international student myself. I was working in Japan as an English language teacher at the time. And 8 years in a remote location. Yeah. And it was the project that I'd worked on back in Ireland was part of a European funded project. So what I liked about that was that my part of it was really advancing knowledge, but also I had a lot of freedom to explore the question that I'd actually had put to me. But I had a lot of support from both the postdocs who were in the research group, other students, and then my supervisors who were chief academics in the department. So I sort of liked that environment of a bigger research question that you were part of, an environment that we were being supported in, but then also the freedom to explore that research question.
I guess that's something that is rarer in industry, where maybe you have to deal with the business as usual more often and more, I guess, practical business problems rather than
pure research.
Yeah.
I mean, now in the CSIRO, we are kind of bridging both of those areas together. So we have some people who are working on very fundamental research questions, what we would call low TRL, low technology readiness level. And then we'll have some people who are working directly with industry partners, producing prototypes and producing systems that are actually being used in industry, in the lab, in factories every single week. And there's one project I'm presenting tomorrow to the CEO of Boeing, who's coming in from overseas.
Wow.
And one of the projects is every 2 weeks there's a deliverable that's actually being handed over to people in the factory. That's actually been used in Seattle on the factory floor every 2 weeks. So there's that kind of very rapid iteration. So you have kind of one end low TRL, very
theoretical,
very exploratory, and very much on the edge. Not clear that there's actually an immediate research need for it. And then very high TRL, which is it's working right now in the factory on the floor, being incorporated into the day-to-day sort of work. Traditionally, universities are in the sort of low TRL space, and industry is in the sort of high TRL space. And CSIRO, we sort of sit in the middle. We kind of bridge both of these together because we work with the university sector, but then we also work with the industry sector at the same time. So that's the sort of difference between where we sit with respect to what industry does, which is much more applied, directly taking the research that we've done and applying it directly into the product stream, versus what's happening in the university, which can be much more exploratory. And I think back to my own PhD or my own early forays into research, it was very decoupled from an applied research question. It was very decoupled from, would this actually be relevant to sort of industry? It was much more exploratory. But you actually need that entire ecosystem. You need people who are working on very exploratory, very blue sky thinking. At the same time as you need people who are sort of translating between that very blue sky and much more applied. And then you actually need people who are up at the very applied research end of the spectrum, who are really working with industry, working on taking research, embedding it into practice, embedding it into product, embedding it into the next sort of strand of activity. So it's a big, broad ecosystem of research, and you need people at all different points in the space.
Because of what you've mentioned, the difference between more university research and industry research, is there like a split? Is it like a 50-50 split between the cases, or most of the time it's actually pretty theoretical and very few projects are industry in your experience?
In the university sector, or here in CSIRO, or where?
In CSIRO or in Australia in general, or is that too broad?
No. Well, no, in CSIRO it's very applied. I mean, the I in CSIRO is for industrial, so it is very much about translating the work that we do. It's very much about having impact. It's not just about creating research publications. It's not just about creating, a proof of concept and then just letting it sit on the shelf. It's very much about that whole pipeline of. If you're doing a particular piece of research, is it because you're building up the capabilities? Is it because you're building up the expertise? Or is it because you're working with a partner on a particular research question, and there's kind of a direct pipeline out there? University research is quite different. University, as I said, can be a lot more blue sky. But then again, it also depends on the area of research that people actually work in.
Yeah.
So there's some branches of science and engineering where it's very closely tied to industry, because the data or the industrial process is actually is a factor within the research itself, or the places that the experiments can actually happen are in industry. So then it's actually very, very tied to industry. But then there's some places in the university sector where it's very remote. It's very, very disconnected from an actual end use case. So it is a broad spectrum of research that's actually underway.
Got it. And would you say, if you look back at your career in research, would there be something that you would do differently? Or if you were to start your research career again as well, like is there something that you would want to tell yourself when you were younger, starting out in a research journey, something you didn't expect when you started?
Yes. I mean, one thing that I've probably done a lot of, it's helped me now into the role that I'm currently in, because I have to have a very broad view of science. So I was a computer scientist. Well, I was a computer scientist, and I became specialized in human-computer interaction.
Yeah.
And then I became head of school in UNSW. And then I had to sort of have this broad view of all computer science coming together within the school. But now that I work in the National Science Agency, I have to look at all of the other branches of science that we have working here within the National Science Agency, and how computer science and AI and data science interconnects with those things. So I'm glad and lucky that I did the type of research that I did. That was the sort of human-centric, user-centric, looking at human problems, thinking about in an empathetic way, thinking about the end user and how they would be interacting with the systems. But if I was to go back again and start again, I might spend more time working with more multidisciplinary research earlier on. So at the beginning, I was very focused on algorithms, very focused on information visualization, very focused on the data and the algorithmics in a very kind of traditional classical kind of computer science type questions, very divorced from the human questions, very divorced from other branches of science, very divorced even from like how this might actually get used in real practical applications. And I think now, if I was to start again, I would go back and take more time doing looking at non-computer science questions in my research early on, to kind of broaden out the view, and then actually get good at synthesizing different viewpoints from, say, manufacturing, material science, or topics in quantum, or branches from health and biology, and bringing those different kind of perspectives together on the research. So I think that's one thing I wish I'd done more of. And it was an artifact of how my undergraduate degree was set up. It was very much focused on the computer science pieces, very limited scope for actually taking in other inputs from other areas, and the same thing for the computer science PhD. Even to this point today, the PhD itself has evolved a little bit, but hasn't evolved massively. One of my students who I supervise in UNSW is submitting today. And I was looking at his thesis last night and then looking over the structure of it. And it's very similar to the structure of other people's PhDs that I've seen in the last couple of years. I'm examining a PhD in the University of Glasgow at the moment, and it's a very similar structure to that. And then if I look on my shelf, I'll see that other PhDs that I've supervised and also my own PhD, and the structure is very, very similar. So I think definitely the next sort of few decades, we're going to have to kind of break away from that. We're going to have to kind of break open the PhD process and think a little bit differently about it. So we're sort of stuck a little bit at the moment in terms of what the doctorates actually look like. And then that's going to have to sort of change. But in some ways it's comforting because it means that the way that we do the research and the way that we actually get people to put together the research outcomes into a thesis is well structured. But it is also possibly stuck in terms of how it actually can have real impact in the world.
Yeah, because you have to commit to going deep into one idea and one kind of area. That's why there has to be like kind of
so I mean,
depth in at least one thing.
That's right, and it has to be the contributions to knowledge have to be very clear in the work that you've actually done. I would say an important part of a PhD. So I guess to roll back. I mean, for your podcast, there's, how do people get involved in research along the whole trajectory of their career? Like, how do they get involved? So early on, I was an intern working in a company, and I got an opportunity to do a little bit of research on the side. And I understood that I had a question, but I had to discover it and find the real question. Like, I had this kind of a starting point, but then I had to do more work myself to discover what the question would be. And then I went on to do an honors degree, and then I realized actually that was the job, was to actually take a broad question and kind of get it narrow and get it specified. Then I went on to do a PhD, and the search in research is incredibly important. When students start out doing a research topic, they'll define a sort of a fairly broad question. Then they'll start doing their literature review. They'll start looking at related work, and then they'll start to actually realize, my question is either too broad or isn't actually the right question. And they'll then actually have to spend time finding the question. And that's really what people will do in a PhD, is they'll spend all of this time digging in, making sure that the question is the right question to ask, and then actually spending time answering that question and putting it all together. And also understanding that two things about the PhD as one, it's a period of research training to understand how to do this again by themselves. And also it's not the best bit of research they will ever do. It's the first bit of research they will ever do. Some people set the PhD up as this sort of like, this is the pinnacle of my research career. But if that's the case, then everything from then is downhill. So why would you try to do that?
Don't be too hard yourself. For
exactly.
the first piece of research that you do.
That's right. And also be kind of confident in critiquing your own work. And the PhDs that I enjoy examining are the ones where people have identified what their research contributions are, have made it clear at the very beginning what their research question is, how they would actually show how they would answer this question, and then they go through various case studies and actually show what they have or haven't done. And then along the way is saying, this didn't work well. This was actually kind of a failure, and actually pointing out where things didn't work as well as they have.
Yeah, kind of incrementally and improving, get better,
exactly,
improving constantly.
Exactly. So understanding that it's a research process, and if everything is just, if you write it up as if it's all perfect, it's not realistic, because that's not how science goes. Science has lots and lots of failure built into it. And if you're not taking risks, and if you're not failing with experiments, then you're not trying hard enough.
Right. You're doing something that maybe already had an answer to.
Exactly.
So the point is kind of keep trying things and then seeing where it's working or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And having a good way to assess why you're continuing that particular avenue of inquiry. It might be that the research methodology is not right. It might be that the question's framed too broadly. It is often that question of it is often people are trying to bite off too much in one question, and then they're actually using maybe a specific method or some mixed methods approach, and then they're trying to do too much in one study, or they're trying to do too much in one research inquiry, and then there's too many things that they actually have to control for. There's too many confounding variables, and they can't control for all of those. And at the end, the results they get back, the data they get back, isn't clearly helping them answer the question that they framed initially.
Those are really great insights, I guess. For someone starting out in research, I think I've seen that a lot. I'm doing a bit of research as well, and I have a lot of friends who do PhD as well. And it's definitely a very mentally challenging process. And you do have to start thinking about how do you kind of incrementally improve on what you do. It's not necessarily always like, exactly the research question. You do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you get there. It's sometimes that's why it feels a little frustrating, like you have to re-correct your course sometimes. So on the topic of doing research in Australia, do you feel like there are, your expertise is in computer science, but now you've also worked a lot across a lot of different areas in science. Are there areas you feel like there's a very strong investment or trends that you're seeing that someone who's starting in research now should look into, or?
Sure. I mean, the big one, of course, at the moment, there's so much work in AI.
Yeah.
There's so many. But the danger, I would say, for anybody who's interested in doing research that's related to AI is to make sure that you're partnering or getting the right kind of supervision, so that you're just not playing some sort of fast follower there. And also that you're just not taking, there's a huge tendency I see in lots of branches of science at the moment to take AI techniques off the shelf. That might be a large language model, it might be some machine learning technique that's been existing, and then just taking the data that you have, taking machine learning, taking an LLM, feeding it in, and then getting a 2% improvement over the existing techniques, and then trying to publish it, or also trying to claim this as a contribution to knowledge, but not really a contribution to knowledge, not really advancing knowledge in any way. It just happens to be taking advantage of a huge amount of compute and a huge amount of data processing that's been made available. But there's no real theoretical improvement to what you've done. It's just, you're literally just using a black box to turn a crank and an out pops a slightly better result, but you have no understanding as to where that is. That's the danger of AI at the moment, is that people are just using it in a very ill-considered manner, and then turning the crank, getting an improvement, not understanding why, and then trying to find contributions to knowledge. I see that a lot at the moment. We see that a lot across the board. And it'll be the same thing with advances in quantum, either in quantum information, quantum cryptography, post-quantum cryptography. People will start making advances, and then quantum computation will improve over the next few years. People will start taking existing problems, feeding those into this new platform, gaining improvement, and then showing this 10% improvement, and then trying to claim that as a contribution to knowledge. And these are the dangers that we face when we have these new purely digital systems or new physical digital systems, where basically they have so much data, or they have so much computational power associated with them, that you can get computation improvements, but they're not grounded in any sort of understanding of the physics or the chemistry or the biology or the social process that's actually included in the question that you're actually answering. It's a data-driven improvement, and there's no real theoretical improvement. It's not the improvement that you're making is not based on a theory that's associated with that branch of science. It's disconnected. It's literally just a computational edge that you found. Just the danger.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess because it's so easy to do that and to claim maybe like a novelly sounding kind of method. It makes I guess it reflects on how the research could be a little, it might be too applied. It might be just like a use case. Basically, you can show that, this works in this use case.
That's right.
More so that it's like a contribution to knowledge or actual.
Yeah, it is it's a computational improvement rather than a real advancement in knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is there any cons to a research career, if there's any that you experience?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. the whole time. That's kind of the important thing in a research career is you're at the forefront of knowledge. So if you just think of all of human knowledge as this pie, you as a researcher kind of want to get to the edge, and then you're looking out into the abyss effectively. So you're looking out into very uncharted territory, very uncertain. If I take a step this way or take a step this way, I could fall off the edge and just, die.
on the research paragraph.
Only on the edge of research, you are stepping out into the unknown, and it feels quite lonely. It feels quite risky. If you were just given something, like if you were further back from the edge of knowledge, from the edge of then you would actually be working maybe something where you're engineering or you'll be giving a set of specifications, and I feel it's much more comfortable because somebody says, I need a new app. Here's a new phone that's been produced. It's got a new sensor. And we've got some new data. We've got some clients who want this particular feature to be made available for their customers. Can you put A, B, and C together? Can you develop and build it and actually engineer? And there's a lot of challenges, a lot of hard work involved in the engineering of it, but there's not so much unknown. Whereas when you're right at the edge of where we currently have knowledge, you're building the piece of knowledge that you're going to step out onto. You have to be willing to kind of put your foot forward and actually say, well, okay, I don't think there's anything, it's not clear there's anything there, but if I put together these ideas and if I advance knowledge here, then actually I think I can create this new bit of land, and then I can step out. And then you're like, oh, excellent, I was able to step out and I didn't careen off the cliff. That's every day as a researcher. Like every day as a researcher is, you want to be at the forefront of knowledge creation. And the people who are creating that new branch of knowledge, it's you. And you're sometimes alone and sometimes you're putting together things. I see it every day. I mean, I see so many different pieces of the puzzle coming together, and I see people, getting a new publication or proposing a new project, or they talk about how they've connected a few dots together in a particular way that no one else has connected the dots together. And sometimes it sounds ludicrous. It sounds just like, how could these things come together? But then you actually understand what they've done is they've broken it down. They've found pieces of the puzzle that fit together in a way that nobody else has before. And then you actually just have confidence that they've done this in a systematic way, that they've actually set this up so they actually can experiment with this. This is sometimes the problem that we have in research, is that when you put together your ideas, you have to be able to validate them in some way. There has to be some mechanism for validation. And for all of human knowledge creation outside of science, and some of those forms of validation can take decades. If you're thinking about, if you want to make an advancement in economic theory, if you want to make an advancement in understanding of social science or human biology or medicine, these things take time, and how you validate them is different in different areas of human knowledge creation. And sometimes some of these validations are not as quantitative as people would like. They're much more qualitative. And quantitative is for a lot of people, they're very happy with a quantitative method. You run an experiment, out comes a number. You can run it 10,000 times. You can average the number, and then you can look at how that's actually improved over the existing numbers. And people get great confidence in these kind of quantitative measures. And yeah, you can plot. But then, of course, not all types of knowledge creation can actually work that way. There's lots of things where you have to use qualitative approaches, where you have to look at, if you want to make a new economic theory, like how do you validate that? If you have a new idea in finance, you have a new idea for a business process.
Yeah.
And it's that whole kind of piece of knowledge creation, actually understanding that human knowledge advances in different ways, but then we validate it in different ways and being comfortable with that. And that's definitely, I think, one thing you were asking earlier about things I wish I'd known earlier. I think I wish I had thought, or I had been exposed more early in my career to the fact that how knowledge creation, how we validate contributions to knowledge across the breadth. Billions of people on Earth, hundreds of thousands, millions of people are involved in research. And there's such a broad spectrum of knowledge creation that's actually going on. And of course, I come from, a computer science background, which is, very grounded in a kind of a mathematics background. And then that kind of shapes your thinking about how you validate contributions to knowledge in that area. But then suddenly you realize, well, this knowledge that we're creating also connects to something in physics, and they do it slightly different. And this also actually connects to chemistry. And then you actually see both, chemistry and physics that had, Nobel Prizes that have been kind of drawn out of work that's actually happened to computer science in the last few decades. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it's all interconnected. And then you start to go a little bit further and you start to realize, well, it's, especially for me with, human interaction, you deal with, humans and human psychology and human physiology and all questions around what it is to be human. And you're talking about making a contribution to knowledge and computation and changing how humans interact with that. So suddenly it's this much more complicated system where you have to deal with the computer and you have to deal with the humans and you have to deal with the interconnection between them. And you've got multiple humans and multiple computers. And suddenly it's a much more complicated space. But just actually being comfortable with knowing how you validate contributions to knowledge in these types of spaces is a real challenge in research.
Yeah. Maybe that's not a con. Maybe that's that's a challenge that you have, and that's a part of it. It's a part of the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So it's like another. Okay, if you're looking for kind of definitive cons, the arc over which your contribution to knowledge will turn into practical impact in the world, that can be long. That can be very, very long, and that can be kind of dispiriting for people. I think as a con, it can feel a long time between having a research idea, finding a problem and then coming up with a research idea that actually solves that problem, validating it, publishing it, getting other people who do follow-up research, building it, finding an industry partner to actually work on the generation of impact associated with this, it actually getting embedded into product, it actually then being used by people and then actually making somebody's life possible. I think the things that I did back in Ireland that are now 17 years later are now actually in commercial product, but it's like 17 years. You have to wait. And that can become a con because if you're working on a very defined research project, so if you're in a very defined development project within industry, it might be something that you work on today and then 6 months later people are using because you're so much further back from the edge of the unknown in terms of knowledge creation, and you're on much more sort of solid ground. So you can just do that and then it can be used within 6 months. But at the research, you're at the edge, and there can be lots of uncertainty by stepping across that sort of threshold.
Yeah, and you've been an international student before here, and I'm sure in your work there's a lot of experience you've had with international students who came here. Do you see that there's like a significant difficulty for, say, international students who want to step into research? And has it been more difficult, or are there things that make it a little harder in your experience and what you've observed?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. International students are battling a complicated landscape when they step into research or just being international students here. So for a start, they're leaving their own homes, their own cultures, often their own linguistic backgrounds, and then coming, and every single day is a cultural change. Every single day is a societal change. Every single day can be a linguistic change. And then on top of that, sometimes their educational background can be quite different than the Australian education system. And also just how they've been brought up to interact with their educators can be quite different than what's the expectation here in Australia. It's very much a supervisor here should be seen as a guide, should be seen as giving supervision advice, should be seen as a person who's telling the person, well, if I was in your position, this is what I would do. Like looking at the options that you've actually discovered so far, and spend a little bit more time thinking here, weigh these two against each other. Of these three, how would you prioritize them? It's very much about guiding students in terms of what they're going to do in their research career. In other cultures, it's more prescriptive. Exactly, more prescriptive, and that's interesting because that's actually a global phenomenon. So, I mean, I don't want to name particular countries and backgrounds, but people would say like, oh, there's certain parts of the world, but it's not one geographic region. I can actually point at countries on every continent, literally every single continent. I can pick examples of universities or companies or organizations that I've seen, and I've seen how the supervisory relationship works, and it's very prescriptive. So literally, I was just in South America recently, and I was listening to a supervisor tell me about how they work with a student, and I was like, that's very different than Australia. Same thing in parts of Europe, same things in parts of Asia. And I've seen it, like I've just seen it. The advice isn't advice; it's basically being told
Instructions.
It's instructions. And now the danger for that is when you finish a PhD, you're on your own. Like it's then you're the person who's going to have to be basically making these decisions all by yourself. You're not going to be given a set recipe. You're going to be standing at the edge, not knowing which way to go, making sure, and then knowing how to put your foot out into the unknown and what you actually need, when you need to have confidence, and how you need to decide on which direction to take. And if you've gone through a doctorate where you've been basically told, go this way, don't go that way, I'm not sure that really sets you up. Whereas in Australia, I think you are better, there's a better expectation of, I'm going to guide you. I'm going to say, like, if I'm standing at this point in the future and I need to make a decision, what information do I need to have to give myself confidence to go this way, not that way? And that's the good thing that you get in Australia. Less prescriptive. But also, it's much more about that sort of individual contribution to knowledge. That's one of the downsides, I think, in Australia, is that there's less opportunity to be part of sort of bigger initiatives. So it is still an individual contribution, but it's a trade-off. But I think you get set up well for a PhD in Australia for doing this research again and again by yourself when you don't have a supervisor around.
When you say that, you're saying like, oh, if there's like a bigger research group and the supervisor has a very clear piece of work that they want you to work on, and that's a benefit of being in maybe a bigger initiative and theme, but the trade-off is you're not having the independent research training.
That's right. And I mean, it is that kind of lonely. It can. So that's definitely one advice I would have for PhD students. It can feel like a very lonely time. Often the student cares about the research very much. Their supervisor cares to the extent that they want to make sure the students finish. The family of the student care to make sure that the student actually gets done. They don't understand what the student is doing almost, and their friends almost never understand. So nobody really understands what you're doing apart from you and your supervisor. And at the end of the day, you have to be confident and comfortable being uncomfortable in that kind of situation, because it's that unknown. It's like, have I done enough? Have I actually made a contribution to knowledge? Because I think that the worst thing that people feel when they're doing a PhD is that they're not at the forefront of knowledge, that actually they're much further back from the edge of knowledge. And what they're actually doing is they're rediscovering, they're going over old ground that other people have already discovered. That's the big fear that people have. And that's why you have to be systematic with how you actually tackle doing your research in terms of, let's say, literature reviews and all things like that. And it gives you confidence that you're at the edge and that there is space for contribution.
Nice. I guess one of the questions that I think I came in with is also, if someone wants to work in industry, do you think that experience in research would help them, or do you think that that's not too super relevant, or it depends on the research that they do?
Well, actually, also depends on what the industry
you want.
Okay, yeah, no, not just. I mean, also how the industries, how they view the value of having research in the mix. So, is it an industry that's actually happy to use existing techniques, taking existing approaches, following what other people have done? Do they actually see research as giving them a competitive advantage? So if they don't see research as giving them a competitive advantage, then they're just taking stock standard approaches and they're just applying them. They're putting them together in ways that anybody could. But if they're willing to invest in research and they're willing to invest in having people step to the edge in a very kind of unknown space and then actually making big contributions to knowledge, they have to be willing to take, industry has to be willing to take risks. So first is to try to decide, are you working in an industrial sector that is more or less risk averse in terms of research, or does it actually need, or is there actually research that needs to be done? I always think doing a PhD, doing a master's by research actually doing any piece of research in your career sets you up for success in industry regardless, because it gives you a different way of thinking about the problem. It just helps you to be much more systematic in your thinking, your approach, and being comfortable, as I said, with being uncomfortable, not knowing all the answers before you start a particular project. So employing people who have that kind of research training, those research skills is good, even if it's not being directly applied to new forms of research.
Yeah, that's really awesome. So yeah, well, I support more people doing research as well. There's so much that we need to discover. And yeah, I mean, I think that most of the questions I've asked are about research. I think that at the end of this podcast, I wanted to ask just one more question that's a little bit different. We've talked a lot about AI. How have you seen AI? How do you see it influencing the way people do research, writing research even, or researching, or finding out new problems? How do you see the use of AI in
research?
Yeah, and how is it changing research, and how is it changing education?
Oh yeah, I mean, both. We have a large program here within Day 61 around using AI for science.
Yeah.
It's called Science Digital. Hundreds of people working on different use cases, everything from genomics to quantum. It's supporting people in different phases of research. So sometimes it's being used in the ideation stage, in the thought process, where people are having a question about or are thinking about any particular line of research. And for example, conducting a literature review, doing that. Traditionally, if I had a PhD student coming in and I said, begin with a literature review, that could take months. That could take 6 or 9 months for somebody to do a really thorough literature review in an area. But if you're stepping into if you're on the edge of human knowledge creation, and then suddenly somebody comes and says, oh, I've got this question, or this idea of how connecting advances in grass production with soil management, with energy waste use, and I've got this idea, and suddenly you've got these 3 branches of knowledge, and you have to quickly ascertain how do these things interconnect, and what's the nomenclature overlap between them, where's there kind of common problems or common difficulties that are in there. That's where you could basically start using AI techniques, actually go out and troll literature, troll all these kind of sources of information to kind of find all these patterns and commonalities for you, so you can actually start answering those questions. So in the early stage, actually, there's a lot of opportunity for AI to help people just quickly get answers and quickly helps them think about the space that they're actually moving into. And then, of course, when you actually move into the research itself, there's lots of opportunities there for actually using AI techniques all the way through.
And you support, and so you're in support of a lot of.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the interesting thing with these types of AI developments is that it's actually happening already. So science and the process of scientific discovery has
to adapt and evolve.
And it has been evolving. It's been constantly evolving. So there won't be a moment where somebody will flick a switch and then say, okay, now it's all AI enabled. It'll all be incremental. People will change how they do their literature reviews, will change how they set up their experiments, will change how they set up their reporting of experiments, will change how. So there'll be all these examples. One researcher will do it, and then 1,000 of the researchers will be inspired by them, and then they'll start to do it. A research funder will start to make calls for how they actually want to invest their research funding to support, and they'll make a small change around giving some of that resource to support the AI infrastructure. So there'll be all these small changes that'll happen across the entire landscape, and all of that will basically change how we do the scientific discovery. And it won't, as I said, it won't be like a light switch that'll just flick one day and suddenly all be AI enabled. It'll just be lots of little incremental changes across the board. But I can see now, like we have, as I said, we have this AI for Science program, but there's thousands of groups around the world who are trying to do exactly this as well, trying to make it change the scientific discovery process. Often with one of the criticisms, as many criticisms of using AI, is this kind of ensuring that it's grounded in real facts and figures, grounded in real ideas, not just hallucinating. So people often point at AI systems and critique them for hallucinating ideas, but humans hallucinate as well. So we're like humans hallucinate. They hallucinate in a different way than the AI systems do. But getting both of them to be grounded in, okay, you come up with an idea, but can you explain that in terms of existing literature and in terms of the existing data that we have, the existing processes we had, and actually pointing back to real examples to base that on. And that's pretty much what PhD students will be expected to do as well in their theses. They'll come up with statements, and even now, like I'm reading through a PhD thesis, the statements, it's people are saying things, and then you're getting into the introduction of the thesis, or you're getting into the introduction of an experiment, and people just make all these claims and statements, and you're reading through them, and you're like, yep, that's understood, that's well known. And then somebody will say something, you're like, you've now stepped out, you're now connecting the dots out into a new space. Okay, that's fine that you say that, but where's the evidence? Like, where's the evidence that actually those dots do connect? And then you actually then have to kind of jump ahead or jump around in the thesis to actually find where there's actually evidence to support that. And that's where you start wondering, is this well-grounded? Is there evidence to back up this science, this claim? Exactly. And it's claim with evidence. That's basically what you want to do. But it's being able to put together the claims and understanding the contributions to knowledge. And again, understanding it's a period of research training. It's the first big bit of research people will do, not the best bit of research people will ever do. And keeping in mind that you have to care a lot, you supervise your work career, to make sure that you're on track.
Yeah.
But being comfortable with kind of being comfortable, I think is important also for a research career.
Yeah, be comfortable with the uncomfortable. I think that's a tagline for today. Career in research, or in life in general. Yeah. Thank you so much, Aaron. I think that really has brought me like a much deeper understanding of the research as a career, and why it's beautiful, why it's meaningful to do, and why it's also hard to do. Things that you can expect in a research career. And you're right, like international students deals with much more than those pieces, and doing their work or like getting into their career or building their career, or they're also trying to do other life. Yes. So there are all those things that come into play. But at the end of the day, if you love discovering knowledge and that's the activity that you enjoy, I think that international students have plenty of opportunities to do that in Australia. I think CSIRO is a great organization, and also other universities in Australia, there are opportunities for students to do that and to pursue academia and research. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Aaron, so much for sharing all of your insights. And I really hope that CSIRO in Australia will have a lot more amazing research opportunities for students, international and local. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of diaXpora. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn, and follow on our journey to build a strong, thriving diaspora in Australia. See you next time.